Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar by Randy Oliver. My name is Pat Bono, president of New York Bee Wellness, which is an independent educational grassroots charitable 501c3 organization. Its mission is to educate small-scale sideliner beginning beekeepers. We do have a YouTube site with past in-person and online presentations, including many by Randy. New York Bee Wellness sends out newsletters several times a year, and it also conducts statewide surveys twice a year for non-migratory beekeepers in New York State. 2021 is our 7th year of collecting data. Okay, Randy, so glad to see you back. Good to see you. Thank you very much. So what have you been up to?
Well, I've been busy. I had a little issue with a tumor from the papillomavirus on the base of my tongue in the spring and got chemoradiation. I lost the ability to talk or hardly eat. And I'm recovered now, doing well. Looks like they completely eradicated it. So I've been hopped right back into bee research and have been busy, have a few trials running right now. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. And okay. Slideshow from the beginning. There we go.
All right.
Okay, so I have a lot of stuff I could cover. I think we'll be able to get to maybe these first 4 of them right here. So I'm going to blast fairly quick through them, and then Pat, if there's questions coming in, Pat's going to hold the sign so I can answer them. Otherwise, I can answer questions at the end. So one of the questions out here in California, we have very different conditions than you have in New York. We have hot summers, but our summers are very dry. We run often around 10–15% relative humidity. And with climate change, we're getting hotter and hotter summers. So we're 100 degrees Fahrenheit and 15% relative humidity. And that's tough on the bees. And they madly forage for water during the day. And they come back, when we take a lid off a hive during the heat of the day, the comb that they put on the top bars is just full of water. You can just reach in there and lap that up, just pure water. So they pile that water on top of the top bars to evaporate. And they can drop that temperature. The top of a dark hive cover can be like 155 degrees Fahrenheit out in the sun. On the bottom side, it runs around maybe 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And then in that 1/4 inch gap between the bottom of the migratory cover and the top bars, it drops from that 110 degrees down to just a little bit over 90 degrees, 95 or so. And then it'll drop down clear to brood nest temperature, 94 degrees below that. So they're able to drop that temperature very quick. What I was curious about is if you fed water to the bees inside the hive, would they have the same behavior? Would it be the same bees, the water carrying bees that Dr. Tom Seeley has shown specific bees in the hive, specific foragers forage for water and then pass it back to mid-age bees when they come back to the hive? I was curious if you offer on a hot day water inside the hive, what they would do. So I offered several hives, 2 different chick waters, one full of heavy syrup, 77% sugar solid, so very, very almost as dense as honey. Which is tough for the bees to lap up because it's so thick, or just plain old tap water on this side. And to my surprise, even in this really hot, dry weather, they mobbed the heavy syrup and almost ignored the water. They take down 1/4 water a little bit more than once a day. And that's looking back at some data from the Tucson lab, USDA lab. They found roughly the same kind of consumption rate of water when bees were flying into the hive. So they do use it, but they had much more interest in the syrup than in the fresh water. That surprised me a bit because there were plenty of foragers flying out for water. I could see the track of them through the air heading to our watering pond. So then I was curious, well, what do they do with that water when they bring it into the hive? So I set up 4 trays, alternating them. One of them, I put heavy syrup and I put red food coloring in it to identify that. And in the other, I put plain water with blue food coloring. I also will put these pine needle pieces into here afterwards so the bees don't drown. And then I waited until a couple hours till they removed all those liquids, and then looked in the combs to see what kind of coloring I could find. It was this was a single deep colony with some room on the sides. It wasn't plugged out. And to my surprise, There's only one place in the entire colony where I found the blue and the red on the same comb, just right here on this outer perimeter. Everywhere else, the colors were very much separated. Some of them I couldn't tell what color it was because it was in dark combs around the dark cells around the brood nests. So I used Q-tips, got a bunch of Q-tips, and stick them in, and it's very easy to tell what color syrup had been stored in them if syrup had been stored or liquid had been stored in them. And as you can see from the ends of the Q-tips, there were only a very few of them that had any blue stored at all, leading me to believe that they likely simply drank much of the blue for water rather than actually storing the plain water. So when I checked throughout the hive, I could find red all around all the brood combs. Any place there was existing honey, they stored that red all throughout the brood combs. The only place I found the blue then were on the outer combs, and they had some partially drawn foundation on the far outside. And I wouldn't have detected it with a Q-tip because most of it had already been dried up. So they put this out here for evaporation. So they evaporatively cool the outer combs of the hive. Also, right along the bottom where the foundation met the top bars, I'd see a lot of stains where this had evaporated, and also on top of the top bars. So clearly what the bees do is they differentiate between the heavy syrup and the water, and put the heavy syrup in where they can eat it, and the light syrup and the water is used for cooling the hive, and apparently some of it being consumed. Okay, another question I get a lot by beekeepers, mostly over on the East Coast, more so than on the West Coast, is oxalic acid vaporization. And I know this is very popular up in the north, and I can make sense because you don't have to open the hive to get in there. But there's a lot of people in warm areas that I guess it's more important for them not to have to open the hive than it is to get in there and do an oxalic acid dribble. Yeah, Pat.
Back to the syrup versus water. Someone asked, do bees favor red over blue? Did you try reversing the blue and the red?
No, I didn't that. And I didn't do that. And one, yes, should do that just to make sure. But in a totally dark colony with no light, they would have no way of telling whether it was red or blue. So that's a good point. That should be done, but I didn't do that. I'd have to retrain myself also to differentiate in a different colony between red and blue too. It's easy for me to train myself to either red for syrup or blue for water. So oxalic acid vaporization is very popular. My crew can't understand why, because for the same effect, we've used the dribble a lot, and when we compare it to the vaporization, we prefer the dribble ourselves. Anyway, the question is, how efficacious is it compared to a dribble? And be aware that it's still not approved for use while honey supers are on the hive. It will be, but there's a new regimen coming along for oxalic acid. They're going to have to work with EPA rather than USDA, because now the USDA is no longer acting as registrant. They're going to have some private party do that. I just found out about this. It's up to the registrant what they want to do with this, if they want to pursue changing the label. So right now, it is not legal to use oxalic acid vaporization on a hive while there's honey supers on it. It's also not legal to use 2 grams in a double deep either. It's still illegal to use 4 grams. Only use 2 grams for a double deep, 1 gram for a single. So I did a little bit of trials at home, and each of these indicates an oxalic acid vaporization. I use mostly using the ProVap. I started off with the Verox right here. And here are our mite counts. Almost all the graphs I show you will have mite counts of how many mites there are per half cup of bees. I'm not going to do any math. I'm going to tell you the raw count of how many mites there were in a level half cup of bees. So I chose a couple of high mite colonies, starting with a mite count of 30 and one about 35. And then did vaporizations every 10 days to see what it would take to get these mite counts, mite drop counts down to close to 0, that I've got most of the mites out of the hive. And it took me about 10 vaporizations to really get the mites under control. So other people questioned this. So I asked, put out the word for some other data sets from other beekeepers who have used it. So I'm going to show you 3 other data sets. This one is from Kevin Gao in Seattle. And he did 3 vaporizations here, 3 in August, 3 in September, and 3 in October. And here's his drops after them. You can see how the drops, these are averages for four hives. So I took all 4 hives followed exactly the same pattern when I graphed them out. So I simply averaged them to show. And my count bumps up quite a bit the day after the vaporization and then drops right back down again. And what he started off in August with this very low daily mite drop. And we want to get back to this low mite drop which would tell us we got decent varroa control. Well, as you can see, despite doing quite a few 9 total vaporizations, that baseline mite drop, he never got back to that. Mites grew despite those 9 vaporizations throughout the season, despite killing quite a few mites. There's 700 mites dropping after that one, and another 200. So that's 900 mites killed, and yet he still has high mite level in that hive. So you can see, if there's any efficacy, you would see these numbers going down, down to 0. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7-day intervals obviously wasn't doing it. So he went to 4-day intervals. That wasn't doing it. So he went to 2-day intervals between them, and finally started to see some results. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I hear people going out and doing 2 vaporizations and thinking they're doing mite control. And yeah, I think that's just wishful thinking. Okay, another beekeeper said, well, does the oxalic acid that I put on the extended release pads, is there a vaporization action of that? Does it vaporize? So I said, well, I really doubt it because there's no vapor pressure to that, but I will do a quickly experiment for you. So I put up, found a high mite hive, shook bees, homogenized the bee sample from high mite hive, stuck the bees into 2 cage cups, fed them some sugar syrup, put them in the incubator overnight, and then counted how many mites dropped off of either of them. And you can see I put a layer of fresh oxalic acid crystals here at incubator temperature, at brood nest temperature and humidity, and no crystals in there, and a screen separating them, so there's no physical contact. If there's any vaporization action, that would cause these mites to drop down. There was no vaporization action there. Did not cause any increase at all. Yeah, Pat.
Doesn't the queen take too much of an oxalic hit with that many treatments?
Good question. I don't know. I've never given that many treatments, but I hear from people is the queens seem to do okay. I know when in my experiment, I didn't seem to see a problem. There's a question on what that amount of oxalic acid vaporization or any extended release, or repeated oxalic applications might do to the olfactory sense of the bees, and smell being so important. I don't know, but I haven't heard, and I don't have any data on the effect on queen. If it was really serious, I probably would have heard about that, but the people who are doing it are not reporting a queen issue. I'd be more concerned about the danger to the applicator. I don't know if how many of you have actually inhaled oxalic acid vapor. When I first heard about it about 15 years ago, I said, oh, I'll do an experiment. And I took some tinfoil, put a little oxalic acid in it, held a match under it, and made a cloud of that white. It's not a vapor at that point. Vapor is clear. You can't see vapor at all. Then it condenses into microcrystals, a cloud of microcrystals. Let that cloud rise up in the air, and then I ran downwind to get ahead of it and turned around. And when that cloud floated down to me, I took a breath in, and that was the last time in my life I will ever do that. It was formic acid. You can have a cloud of formic acid and try to breathe it in, and your lungs won't let you. Your voice will just, your breath will stop and prevent you from inhaling too much, because the formic acid reacts immediately with your mucosa, your tissue in your trachea, and will not allow you to inhale it into your lungs. On the other hand, oxalic acid, that cloud of crystals, they have to dissolve first before they affect your trachea. So your body doesn't recognize that you're inhaling acid crystals. You don't know it until you've got them all the way down inside your lungs, and then it's too late to try to stop breathing because the burning starts and the retching starts. So And that's why my crew, they they looked at vaporization and said, "You got to be crazy. What are these people thinking?" Up to you guys. Yeah.
Is it logical to assume then that your oxalic acid pads time release work much better than vaporization?
I don't know. Let's not assume anything. I'm going to look at data. Okay. And I'll show you data in a minute. Okay. So then the question, this is what I worked on last year, is Varroa control when there's honey supers on the hive. And there's restrictions for each of the different kinds of treatments that are options of what we can use. Here's with the honey supers on. You can see you can't use Amitraz on honey supers on. Oxalic currently is not registered, but it will be because they've removed the tolerance exemption, tolerance for that. So if the registrant steps forward and works with the EPA, they will be able to remove that that tolerance, so we can we'll be able to use it while the honey supers are on the hive. So right now it's only formic acid and HopGuard, the only ones that are approved at that time. So we now have a new HopGuard out. They had HopGuard, then HopGuard 2, then HopGuard 3. So this is improved. It's a little less irritating to the bees. And it has a longer release period in it, or at least that's what it says. Controlled release over 14 days. I'll look at my data here in a minute, and we'll see. And then the Formic Pro, as opposed to Formic Midway Quick Strips, has a sawdust base in it and has a much longer shelf life, and is much, from a practical application, much more applicator friendly. You don't get the blast of formic acid when you open up the packages. So we like the Formic Pro a lot better than the Midway Quick Strips. So let me tell you first, we did a test on 2020 and tried the HopGuard, but I didn't realize that you could repeat it. And since then, I've spoken at length with the manufacturer, and their label was unclear, and a number of us have misinterpreted that. But the manufacturer didn't have data for how often it should be repeated, and asked if maybe I would help collect some of that data. So I ran a relatively small trial, putting the HopGuard into the hive. And these gloves right here are really handy for this kind of messy stuff. And the label, of course, calls for heavy duty, thick nitrile gloves for any of these, but that's just EPA covering their ass. These are disposable restaurant gloves. They cost a penny a piece, so you're not tempted to reuse them. And they're really easy to slip on. More so than that, they're easy to just go whoop and just whip them off your hand and turn them inside out and throw them away in a blink of an eye. So much, we find with us, there's much less chance of us getting acid on anything because we have these throwaway gloves we put on and take off quickly, and very handy for handling stuff, especially like the HopGuard. So I applied 1 strip for every 5 frames of bees. I did it generously, like, so we have maybe 9 frames of bees here, but I put 2 strips in. These were in double deeps, and I applied them one of 2 ways, either repeating them at 7 days 3 times, or repeating them every 14 days 3 times. The weather was hot, hitting about 90s or above every day during that period, and low humidity. You do want to avoid, when you put strips in, to avoid hitting the queen. When you're putting the strips in and you roll over a bee, that hops beta acid gets on that bee, and these bees will be dead in front of the hive the next morning. We saw very little bee kill, much less than we saw with the HopGuard 2 treatment. HopGuard 3 appears to be much safer to the bees. And I have yet, with a fair amount of testing and a lot of hives with the HopGuard, ever find a colony going queenless from sticking them in. But to be cautious, if you're in the brood nest, you should be careful not to roll it, a wet strip over a queen bee. And the colonies did tend to move their brood then away from where the fresh strips were, and even maybe some of them even abandoned one side of the hive with the brood nest and moved to the other side. But then after a couple of weeks with the every other week treatment, the bees would go right, as the strips tended to, I said dry off. They don't really dry it. It gets rubbed off by the bees, the hops beta acid. They would go right back underneath the strip. That I'm just lifting the strip away here to show you that there's brood filling all the cells underneath the strip. So I set this up with some control hives, some hives treated, the green ones treated at 7 days, and the blue ones treated at 14 days. And the blue arrow triangles show when I applied them, the treatments for the 14 days. So that's day 0, day 14, day 28. And the 7 days, the greens were applied every 7 days here. And this is confusing. We're going to look at another graph, a simpler one. This just to show you the variation in here between the groups, that they didn't all respond exactly the same. So when you start talking about means or medians or averages, you got to take them with a grain of salt here. The big question is, why did the control colonies, which went up in mite counts, then go back down by themselves without any hop guard being added to them? And I realized I screwed up. I was short on high mite hives at the time I went to do this. We had 1,500 hives at the time, but we had the mice controlled in them all. The only hives I had that had high mites at the time was in my potential breeder yard. We had brought all the potential breeders back in the springtime that had exhibited very low mite counts. Some of them, though, although they had low mite counts throughout the previous year, the mite counts were rising by the middle of the second year. So I used a number of those colonies in this trial. I realized that was a mistake, because when I looked in them, even though their mite counts had gone up, a lot of them had very strong Varroa sensitive hygiene and bald brood, the uncapping, recapping behavior, and they were able to bring the mites back down on their own accord. And that's why they were potential breeders from their first year's experience, that they, even though they may let the mites go up a bit in the middle of the summer, they are able to bring them back down again by themselves. We have a couple of yards this year that we have a large proportion of the colonies are 100% mite proof on their own. So we may be making progress after 6 years of really hard selective pressure, trying to lock the trait of mite resistance into the maternal bloodlines of some of our queens. We have one queen that has extremely promising, her daughters are extremely promising, because most of the 40 hives in that yard needed 0 mite treatment at all this year. So we're very excited about grafting off of those queens this next year. Anyway, so here I took the averages for them, and it looks much simpler. And if we want to compare the treatments, the day 21 obviously is the best point to compare them. So I want to show you the variation here between them. So these are here's the controls that it looks like, yes, on 3 of them, they still did go up, and 1 of them, they went down by day 21. On the 7-day treatments, pretty consistently, they all went down quite a bit. The blue is your starting mite count. The red is, on all these graphs, you can see the rest of the show. Blue is your starting mite count. Red is your ending mite count. So Pat, here's a question for you. What's the ending mite count right here on this one?
Oh, looks like 0.
You got it. If you don't see red, that means the ending mite count was 0. That's what our goal is in Varroa treatment, seeing no reds at all. And you see over here on the 14-day, again, pretty consistent on all of them, big reduction except for this one hive. So when I go ahead and do the Henderson-Tilton formula, the calculation to calculate the efficacy right here, the 7-day treatment showed about 85% efficacy, 14-day about 82% efficacy. So it looks like there's really not any advantage to doing the 3 treatments. You could probably get by just as well with just the 2 treatments with it. Then I had a collaborator. I had a high school student in Virginia who wanted a project this summer. I said, great, why don't you do get some other data for this? Could you put HopGuard in 3 times and count daily your mite drops from there, so we can see how long the treatment actually causes elevation in mite drop? Because the manufacturer says it works for 14 days. So what I did here, I took his data, and this shows I divided the daily mite drop by the starting baseline mite drop the day before you put the treatment in. So you've got a 5.5 times higher mite drop right here on the day after the treatment was put in, which dropped after 2 days down to 4.5, by 3 days down to 2.5, and by 7 days right back down to the starting mite drop. So that indicates it's not a 2-week elevation of the mite drop. It's about 7 days. He put them in again, and they dropped back down to the starting count after 5 days here. He waited a few days, and they dropped down, well, either at 6 days or 8 days, whether you want to count this coming back to it. But by 8 days, they're back. So this is telling me that by 7 days, the HopGuard has pretty much worn off in the hives, not causing elevated mite drop. So by putting them in at 7 days, then you're going to have, if you do wait 2 weeks, you're going to have mites emerging from the brood, but most of them are not going to get back into the brood within that 7-day period. So they might got hit by this again before they return. Do you have your sign up there, Pat? Oh, I moved your
Yeah,
over.
what were the size of the hives for this?
Those were double deeps also, and those were in Virginia.
And I also have a question about on the topic of your breeding program, the colonies that allow mites to grow and then bring them back down. Are those colonies as productive as others, or does that ability to control mite come at expense?
You know, everybody thinks it's going to come at expense. You're going to wind up with hot bees that swarm a lot and don't do very well. And I'll tell you right now, that is not the case in any way. Our colonies that are we call them our zeros, the ones that just keep getting mite counts of 0 all summer long by themselves. They're often the most productive colonies in the yard, and as gentle as, and we breed for gentleness. We've bred for gentleness forever. They're as gentle as can be. When I've had skeptical commercial beekeepers come out to visit, I say, well, hey, don't be skeptical. Come out here, help me do a bunch of mite washes and help me evaluate these hives. And then after we do them, I said, well, what do you think now? And they go, wow. Have you have changed our minds? No, these are beautiful colonies. We want that's what we want. No, they're very productive and gentle. I have yet to see any trade-off whatsoever for breeding for very strong selective natural resistance to varroa mites. And they're just amazing. I mean, they're right in the yards with all the other colonies, all the other mites, plenty of mite immigration coming in from elsewhere, and mice just don't bother them. They just disappear. So what we found was HopGuard increases HopGuard 3 for about a week. Efficacy was about the same for 2 applications, 2 weeks apart, as for 3 applications. But this trial was way too small. The control group had issues, so it really needs to be repeated. But the take home is HopGuard 3 can be a relatively effective mite treatment in hot weather when honey is on the hive. So that is an option for people. And especially if you have weak colonies where formic might be an issue, HopGuard would be good. Although I will tell you right now, there's a trick for putting formic on weak colonies, and that's simply to cover the top of the pad. And that reduces the evaporation tremendously. We do this in 5-frame nukes in hot weather with very good success. Yeah, Pat. Oh. Okay, so let's go back to the formic now. And Formic Pro, I measured the loss of mass per day by putting these in strips in a double deep box, a drawn comb without any bees, but in 95-degree or better weather. And then I weighed them every day to see what the amount of formic loss was. And the red was Mitaway Quick Strip and the blues were Formic Pro. This is the range that's the optimal range for release of oxalic acid in a hive during the per each day. And you see both of these, you get this blast the first day. If we can get avoid that blast, and there are some tricks, again, by covering, I just did a trial where I put the wrapper over some, and that avoided this blast and then increased all the rest of the days a little bit. So there's probably some tricks you could use with the Formic Pro. I'll extend on that later. Yeah.
A whole bunch of questions about what do you cover the formic with? Saran wrap, baggie?
But I have not done enough experimentation. What I did in that test, I put just a wrapper over it. When we do it in the nukes, we just push the lid down, the migratory cover down tight. So it's just the plywood's tight against the formic pad, and that works beautifully. Very, very good. You can treat them. We use a half of a strip in a 5-frame nuke in hot weather, which is a 3/4 inch plywood cover over it, pressed down, and that works beautifully. Instead of the formic being released over in 4 days and the strip being dry, a week later, the strip is still full of formic and slowly releasing it. So plastic would work. The other thing that I like to experiment with more is parchment paper. Parchment paper is partially permeable to formic acid. And when the formic's gone, the bees chew it all up and throw it all away. So just parchment paper using in the kitchen. I need to do more experimentation along this line, or you guys can do the experimentation and let me know what the results are. Any more questions?
Nope.
Okay. So one beauty of the Formic Pro is the bees, after a few days, once the formic's gone, they chew them up and they carry them outside of the hive, which they didn't tend to do with the MitoWave quick strips. We like this, that they remove it from the hives. Most of the time, not all of them. So there are limitations to both of these. And what I found with the HopGuard is you need to do repeated treatments. One treatment's not enough. Then the other thing I tried was the oxalic acid extended release. And we had previously worked with the shop towels, the blue shop towels. So this year I used the cellulose Swedish sponges cut in half, putting in either one sponge or 1/2 sponge or 2 halves of a sponge. Yeah, Pat?
Someone asked, have you tested Mite Gone?
Yeah, I have. It works. I wasn't crazy about the application method. It's a little more time than I want to spend. I need to do more research with it. I've spoken with Bill about it quite a bit. And I've talked to beekeepers that are happy about it, say it works. I'm looking for something a little quicker for me to put into the hive that doesn't involve toothpicks and recycling the pads, something I can just throw across the top bar. So there are other treatments that work, like the Aluin cap cardboard strips. We drape them over the top bars, but I found it took 8 strips per hive to get good efficacy. And there's nowhere in the world we're going to put 8 strips per hive into 1,500 hives. It's just going to take too long. We're going to crack the hive and toss something across the top bars and close the hive. So that's what I'm focusing on, something for commercial beekeepers who can't spend a half an hour putting a treatment into a hive. And it's not really half an hour, but can't spend 3 minutes putting a treatment in. And so I bought the sponges. We used 1,000 of these Swedish sponges for testing. I'm going to make very clear, this method is not approved for use in the United States. In fact, oxalic isn't even approved in any manner in California yet. We're waiting on a registrant to do that. But I do have a pesticide research authorization from the state of California that I get every year. It says how many hives I can put it into. So it's legal, but I am not recommending that anybody use this because it is not yet registered. Have I covered my ass well enough? Okay. So we tested it with 263 hives in 7 different yards at different elevations. And I like going back after 2 brood cycles, 42 days, and checking for efficacy. High temperatures, low humidity, intentionally all 2nd-year queens, because I wanted to see what the effect of the formic would be on older queens. Weaker colonies, 8 to 10 frame strength with a 2nd brood chamber added. We had a very, very lousy spring with rain, so the colonies were not very strong. And we intentionally started with a wide range of starting mite levels. You get your best data for efficacy if you start with high mite levels. If you go from a mite count of 2 to a mite count of 1, you've learned nothing at all. If you start with a mite count of 30 and you're going down to a mite count of 1, you've learned something. So we intentionally run colonies with the 2nd-year queens and let the mice build up. So I have high mite colonies for these trials. And yeah, this all comes at quite a bit of cost. So I appreciate everybody's donations that allow me to talk my sons into not controlling mites so I can run these experiments. So the treatments we used were a half of a sponge, oxalic glycerin sponge, 2 halves, 1 whole sponge equivalent, some shop towels. We're not going to show that didn't work. The Formic Pro 1 strip repeated at 10 days, and the Formic Pro 2 strips at once, and then some controls. So they weren't really good controls because I started with lower mite colonies in the controls, which doesn't, they're not really legitimate controls, but at least to show what would happen. So here's the putting on the shop towels. This is a Formic Pro pad right here, and this is just a dummy picture just to show you how how they compare in size. That's the size of a half of a Swedish sponge with oxalic acid and glycerin. And there's a HopGuard 3 strip. We also found, or I found, these tongs, kitchen tongs, are very handy for handling these. The label, of course, says always wear gloves, always wear gloves. But if you didn't happen to have gloves, you can handle all these with these tongs very, very safely. Typical test yard, blackberries just coming into bloom right here. We had just put second boxes on most of these hives. And then we got a bloom. And many of the colonies put on a fair amount of honey into that second brood chamber. We collected data where the bees were in the boxes, in their upper box, lower box, whether they're queenless, whether they were queen right, what the starting mite count was, what the ending mite count was, and which yard they're in. There are 7 different yards. This is a little bit of the data. We had it for 263 hives. Okay, a lot of data to crank. So let's show the results here. Again, starting mite counts are in red. I'm sorry, in blue. Ending mite counts are in red. If you see a lot of red, it did not work. If you see a lot of blue, it did work. It did take the mite counts down. So keep that in your mind. Lots of blue is good. Lots of red is bad. And then underneath, these are the yards. So you can see if there was a yard effect. So all the L's are 1 yard. All the O's are another yard. And then for all the yards, I calculate the group median. So half of them were more efficacious, half were less efficacious. That's what a median is. It's halfway, not as opposed to a mean, which is where outliers like this show the mean off. So medians mean half or better, half or less. So there's going to be a group median at the end. So this one is for the controls, and you can see the group median, they went up to 158%. So 1.5 times the ending mites as starting mites. So too much red. This was, so the controls, the mites did go up. This is one Formic strip repeated at 10 days and much more blue except for 1 yard. And we're not quite sure why this was at this 1 yard that we had them going up. And this is one of the mysteries of doing field trials. This is why we do multiple yards, multiple replicates, because sometimes 1 yard is strange. This is 2 Formic strips at the same time. Lots of blue. And again, 2 of them went up, but now they were in 2 different yards. So it wasn't a yard effect there. We just have some colonies. There's some colonies that are mite magnets also that attract bees with mites from other hives. So that may be what we're seeing right here. Anyway, the group median for this was down to 20% of the 1/5 of the starting count, which is good. And you can see with the 1 strip repeated, that was 17%. So we got about the same efficacy with both of those, either of those. Formic really killed the mites. It was obvious and did it very quickly. So if you need a very quick mite knockdown, formic acid is very good for a very, very quick mite down. It's the fastest acting of anything. HopGuard maybe being the second fastest. And then you get into your oxalic, which is a slower knockdown. And as always with after formic acid, the queens come back and lay beautiful brood patterns. I don't know what it is about formic, but you can have a lousy looking brood pattern. And after the treatment, the brood always looks much, much better. And even though we were blasting with formic, which really is very disruptive to the colony, the ones that we treated still, these were all brand new combs in 2020 foundation, and they filled them out and filled them full of honey during the formic treatment. That surprised me quite a bit. And then the queens, again, the queens were all intentionally 2nd-year queens, and many of them were already starting to be superseded by the workers just from running out of sperm, which they tend to do by August of the 2nd year. And the other thing was that the temperature we applied them at, this red line is the maximum temperature recommended for MitoWay Formic Pro. you can see our daily temperatures. This is when we applied the first application, here's the second. The daily temperatures were well above the recommended maximum. So we stressed it so that this was really an acid test for these, the worst possible condition for those queens. And the bees did not like it. And we put them all in the same day, which means that the ones put in the morning was fairly cool. By midday, it's, we're putting 100 degrees and we're putting 2 formic strips in at 100 days. The yards where we did that were really rough on the queens. If you're going to use the formic during the summer, put it in at dusk, okay, so that the colony can cool off. You don't have that big blast right in the middle of the hot day. The second thing is, I don't know that it's the formic that actually kills the queens. When I have caged queens against the comb in a pushing cage directly below formic strips, I don't see that it kills the queens necessarily. That it may actually be the bees that kill the queen due to the smell. And this goes back to the original work by Jim Amrine, who said if you add a Honeybee Healthy at the same time, it would prevent the queen loss. And I have yet to see anybody follow up on that research. Yeah, Pat.
Someone said, did you have a bit of queen supersedure when using Formic Pro?
Good question. In answer to that question, here's this slide. So here is the total number of hives in each of these test groups right here. So we had 40 hives here, 30 hives here, and higher numbers over here. The number, and then at 42 days, I went back and I looked to see if there was a laying queen. Now, many of these colonies had replaced their queen, especially with the formic acid. Many of the queens have been replaced, but you had a new laying queen at day 42. In the low mite controls that had no treatment at all, we had 5% that were queenless at the end of the 42 days. Something had gone wrong with the queen. With the Formic Pro strip repeated twice, only one of them was queenless, less than the control group. For 6 of the 7 yards with the Formic Pro 2 strips, we only had 11% that were queenless at the end. So not much higher, but at the one that we put in the Formic 2 strips right in the middle of the day, 5 out of 5 went queenless. So obviously, don't put it in at noon on the hottest day of the year. HopGuard 3, 0% queenlessness. And for the 3 different oxalic acid treatments, right around the same range as the control group. So the people who are talking about having massive queen losses due to formic acid, I'm not seeing that. Yes, there were a lot of queen supersedures, but not necessarily colonies winding up queenless. By 42 days, you had these vigorous young, fresh queens in there. Okay, now this wasn't a fair test because this was an afterthought to try these shop towels. So I started with low mite colonies, and was not that impressed by that reduction, only to 38%. For 1/2 of a Swedish sponge, 1 strip, a goodly amount of blue, but not really fantastic. Only a reduction of 53% of the starting count. But when we get to 2/2 sponges, now we see a lot of blue and down to only 10% of the starting count. So most impressive was with the 2 equivalent of 1 whole sponge. And when I do the efficacy calculations, I did them 2 different ways. One by adding up the total number of mites in the group at the beginning, at the end, and the other by going by median mite count and ending mite count. So I calculated efficacies 2 different ways. And the winner by far was the oxalic acid and glycerin, 2/2 sponges, outperformed everybody else. All the others did pretty well. Formic did pretty well, but this one was the one that kicked butt on here. Now, the question is, how that oxalic acid, that continual exposure of oxalic acid, did it affect the brood? I'll let Pat give an assessment of how it looked. There's the 2 sponges in there. How's the brood looked after 42 days? How does it look to you, Pat?
Oh, it looks good.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing uniformly from beekeepers who have apparently obtained experimental use permits, because I get a lot of reports from them. Here's where it gets interesting. we were working with some grad students from UC Davis who were monitoring native pollinators at 6,500 foot elevation up in the Sierra Nevada. Go ahead, Pat, with your question, then we'll get back to this.
Well, someone's asking about the oxalic dribble and problems with supersedure affecting the queen's exoskeleton.
I have not seen or heard of any problem from that. We treat every single one of our new fresh laying queens with oxalic in our operation every single year while she's in a nuke. And we have no problems. I published 3 different studies on how those colonies grow. They grow better than the ones that are not treated.
And did you try to refrigerate the pads before application to slow the release?
Oh, it takes like 60 days. Forget efficacy. They're refrigerating it for an hour. It's not going to make any difference for 60 days. Okay. No, we did not refrigerate them. They are applied at brood nest temperature, and that's where they work. Okay. So we had these 3 yards at very high elevation up in the Sierra, and these grad students have been monitoring all the pollinators coming to flowers. And these 3 yards, there were 0 honeybees until we brought bees in for them for their experiments. So what that means is that's a very different situation. Instead of being in a drought situation, these colonies grew in strength tremendously, and they put on a decent honey crop up there. The other thing is they reared drones like crazy, as opposed to the other test where there was no drone rearing at all by that time of year. These guys just were loaded with drones, which means since the mice reproduce best in the drone brood, this would be an acid test for the oxalic acid extended release because so much drone brood was in there. But the main thing is there were no other hives anywhere in the landscape around. So there's no mite immigration from other hives. Look at the difference. Here's 1 half of a sponge and here's 2 sponge halves. And you notice the absence of red on a lot of these. Look at this starting mite count of 50 mites down to 0. Okay, so this is the first yard after 63 days. So I've said it takes a long time to do this. Let's go to the other 2 yards. This is one half of a sponge, and this is a full sponge equivalent. Do you all notice the distinct absence of red here? That means that most of these colonies went down to 0 mite counts, starting up in this 30 to 50 mite range. Colonies ready to collapse soon. And after 77 days, they'd gone back down to 0 mites. Very, very impressive. We actually had a 4th yard too up at a pollination contract in Nevada that was isolated. And those colonies came back looking either better than this. When my son brought them back and I said, whoa, Eric, I'm really eager to get out and mite wash these hives that came back, because they came back just huge and beautiful and full of honey. And I'm taking the samples and he's running the mite washer. And I said, well, Eric, I'm not hearing any numbers. And how's it looking? He goes, Dad, I've never seen so many zeros in a row. So after 2 months, if you don't have much mite immigration, these extended release will take your mite counts from very high counts right down to 0 very, very consistently. So absolutely amazing. We also ran a bunch at home in some other trials. And what we did is we only put a quarter of a sponge in. And we did it early in the season, either hung over the top bars if they were still in the nukes, or a quarter sponge across the top bars if they were in singles. And we followed up on the counts. We put them in June, and then this would be end of July counts for these, down quite a bit. This is September counts. So what we found is we put them in June. We didn't have to even worry about mites until September. The mite counts started going back up again. This is in California conditions. Okay, so that was impressive. Now this made us do another experiment the next year. This year, I'll show you the results of that soon. So oxalic, the extended release is a long-term treatment. It takes a month or more to reach full immigration of efficacy, and works best where there's very little mite immigration. So here's some observations of interest. The Argentinians, in their formulation, they use 2.5 times as much glycerin as I do. Here's some shop towels we put on with the higher glycerin content, and it agitates the bees and they beard out in front, and we do see some adverse effects on the brood. So if you put too much glycerin in, it transfers the oxalic to the bees at too rapid a rate. The other thing is, these are mite drops. Over time, normalized, the green dotted line is the baseline count before putting it in. And you can see it goes up to like 15%, 15 times as much mite drop after a few days, depending on the ratios that we used here. But notice that even though that the mite drop does not go back down below baseline until a month later. It takes a full month before you start getting your mite drop dropping down below the baseline. Very different than oxalic acid vaporization. Now, if you're dropping anywhere from, this is like 4 times as many mites as baseline, and after a whole month of dropping 4 times as many mites, or after a week, you would expect that your alcohol wash count of the infestation rate of the adult bees would also go down. That is not what happens. Here's our baseline for infestation rate. And you notice that alcohol washes, they go up for a month still. So this is really weird. How can you be dropping so many more mites, but yet your alcohol wash counts go up? And of all the explanatory hypotheses to explain this, the only one I can possibly imagine is that the exposure to the oxalic acid is preventing the mites from re-entering the brood cells. And the reason that it's efficacious is not so much from killing the mites, it's because the mites simply stop reproducing. And after 2 months, they just die from slow attrition in the hive from lack of reproduction. That is yet to be tested. So I don't have hard data, but this is a very interesting observation. So the second thing is, this is 50 grams of 25 grams of oxalic acid and 25 grams of glycerin each pad. So 50 grams altogether. Well, how much of that 50 grams actually went into the hive? When I pulled some of the used strips out and reweighed them and then did calculations, only a little bit of that oxalic acid ever made it on the bees. Most of it still remained inside the strips. And on these strips here, when you put these into the hive, they're at that 1-to-1 ratio, it's a supersaturated solution. So a day after you make them, it hardens up and they're stiff from all this crystallized oxalic acid. When you put them then into the hive and the humidity in the hive raises the humidity, that glycerin then absorbs moisture from the hive and it gets liquid again. And that's what allows that release of oxalic acid, that glycerin absorbing moisture, and then that spreads to the bees' bodies. So what we found was it's the surface area that's important, not how much oxalic acid you put in the hive, but how much surface area there is exposed. We're going to come back to that. So I got some reports from a researcher in Georgia saying, oh, it didn't work very well there. And this paper was recently published from Veracruz, and I happened to have been down speaking in Veracruz a couple of years before and took this photograph of an apiary there. This is tropical rainforest down here, very high humidity, and they got very, very high efficacy. My hypothesis why it did not work well in those trials in Georgia was because of mite immigration from, there was a lot of collapsing hives during those trials, and the extended release does not handle a lot of mite immigration well. So now I had some questions. Is there a better delivery matrix than the Swedish sponge? Here's a Swedish sponge strip right here. So I tried a number of different off-the-shelf absorbent products here with a, this is a, this is a thin wipe. Then I tried acrylic felt, a couple of kitchen products, some shop products. This is a maximizer pad product. We'll return to this. And then these cotton facial pads. So I put these into hives. Oh man, I didn't put that data in there. Okay, I need to put the table in here that shows how much was released. So I put them in, weighed them, and I put them in, put masking tape over the top of the frames, and then weighed them afterwards to see what the release rate was to the bees. And that eliminated a number of these. They didn't work. What I really need to do is do more of these titrations. I developed this technique and I have not had time to use it, where I can I adjust the color of this titrant, bromothymol blue, green, to this color right here, so it matches. Then if I drop a B in it, there's no color change unless there's oxalic acid on that bee's body. And depending on the amount of oxalic acid, it will take it all the way to an orange color. And then you drop in a drop at a time of a titrant, and you turn the color back to blue. And when it turns back to blue by number of drops, it tells you how many micrograms, millionths of a gram of oxalic acid were on that bee's body. It takes you about 15 seconds to run one of these tests. I got to get on this and do them. Let's see. Do you have your hand up there, Pat?
Yeah, a couple of questions on the glycerin. Any issues when using oxalic acid and glycerin while feeding?
Tell you what, let's hold these questions till I get done with this.
Okay.
Because many of these questions are going to be answered anyway. Okay, so the Swedish sponge strips, they work nice in these narrow strips because you put them in a tub like this and pour the oxalic, the mixture over it. You don't have to flip them over. But then, so we were curious about using these. Here we're using half sponges right here, but those do require usually flipping them over once to get better absorption. So this is not approved, but I would bet money this is going to be a game changer for our industry. I've been trying to really work with EPA and USDA, and it's like trying to move a mountain with a feather. It is the most frustrating thing I have ever done. I just got bad news that I said, how can you guys not even notify me of what you're doing when they just did an exclusive license to a private entity as a registrant, where our industry should have been the registrant on this. If USDA is not working with us on this, I'm really disappointed. But they did do an FDA did an exemption from tolerance, which means we will eventually, if the registrant works on this, be able to use it when the honey supers are on. And I have collected data and looked at data from Europe. With the extended release, there's no increase, appreciable increase in the oxalic acid content of honey. It's a natural component of honey. So you're not a problem using it when the honey supers are on. So back to my question, better matrices here. Oh, I already just showed you that one. Oh, there they are. There's that table. So I could rule some of these out, but there were a few that still looked good. Here I am making some more. Sorry about that. These ones, I was hoping that the bees would pull the fibers off the cotton and drag them through the hive, but they didn't do that, unfortunately. So now my questions. Is there a minimal dose or surface area per hive? Can you dose proportional to mite infestation rate? Can you use a smaller treatment if there's fewer mites in the hive than for a high mite hive? And how do the Swedish sponges, the Maximiter pads, or the acrylic felt compare? These three were the best from that initial trial right there. So we put anywhere from 1 to 4 strips in per hive, proportional to the starting mite count. So if it's very low mite count, we put one strip in, and if it's a high mite count, we put 4 strips in. And here's just the final data, and we waited for 55 days. And you can see with one strip of which one's this? This is the Swedish sponges. Lots of red, not much blue. So which means that the mite count went up. So that was not enough. And you can see this is the blue lines. This is for very low starting mite count. So this is 4 or fewer mites in a mite wash. For the range of 5 to 10 mites in a mite wash, with the 2 strips, it did okay. 3 strips, where we started with anywhere from 10 to 30 mites in the starting mite wash, did pretty good, mostly blue here. And we only had 1 colony in this group that had a very high, a 40 mite count, and that went down to 0. So for the Swedish sponges, it looks like it takes a full sponge. Each one of these strips is a quarter of a sponge, so a full sponge equivalent surface area. For the Maximizer pads, 1 strip, we saw it going up, so not as good, even as good as the sponges. 2 strips, okay. 3 strips is looking good, same thing, 4 strips. So either of those is going to take the same amount of surface area. So our take homes are: a full Swedish sponge, that amount of surface area holds 50 grams of oxalic acid. And it gives you 60 square inches of substrate. So it's going to take 60 square inches of substrate surface area to use it this way. The aluminum cap strips, the cardboard strips that you hang over the top of the frames, I found out that it took 80 grams to get equivalent efficacy that we get at 50 grams just laying it across the top bar. You don't want to put too much glycerin in. The New Zealanders use an intermediate dilution between the two dilutions, and I'm currently got a trial running on that right now, and we definitely need to experiment more. Here is what I have proposed to, just hang on, Pat. There's what I have proposed to the EPA right now. I'm supposed to be having a meeting with them later this month, and that is from New Zealand. They have an own use exemption for beekeepers. And I blew this up here. I'll read it to you. In a beekeeping context, the own use exemption is commonly used when a beekeeper prepares and applies preparations containing generic substances, such as oxalic acid or formic acid, to their own hives for control of varroa mites. I'm saying, EPA, why don't you make it easy for everybody? Get your own self off the hook and just give us an own use exemption and let us take responsibility for this. You're not worried about getting into the honey. We're not going to hurt anybody. Oxalic acid is an organic product approved for organic use. It biodegrades rapidly. Let us just do this ourselves and get the heck out of this picture. Wish me luck, okay? And I want to thank those people who have donated for this kind of research. And I will now stop my share and can go back to taking questions.
Okay, have you ever used the use pads if they still, if they can still kill mites since they still have a good amount of solution in them?
Nope, haven't even tried that. Because the thing is when you scrape them out, they're pretty messy by that time. Yeah, I don't think it's worth. I don't think it'd be worth the time.
How would a wet summer on the East Coast affect glycerin oxalic pads?
From what I've heard, not at all. I get texts and emails from plenty of beekeepers in very humid areas, from Florida, from Pennsylvania, and I have to assume that they've got experimental use permits, and they are just waxing poetic. One beekeeper from Pennsylvania who ran his bees up to New York so East Coast right there. He's been sending me photographs all summer long. These hives put on 125 pounds of honey. And when he pulls all the honey off, he's showing me pictures of these wall-to-wall hives full of healthy bees and brood and no mites. So very, very happy with them.
Okay. Do you put strips in both boxes?
No, just we lay them right between the two brood chambers.
So 3 strips per brood box per hive?
4 strips.
4 strips.
Yeah, and it's not that. Total surface area of 60 square inches, which is the equivalent. A Swedish sponge is 7.5 by 8 inches. That's 60 square inches. And when we cut that into quarters, it took 4 quarters or 1 whole sponge. So somewhere in that ballpark of 60 square inches.
Any issues when using oxalic and glycerin while feeding?
Yeah, if you use a top feeder that might drip, you need to put the strip away from where a drip might come down. Otherwise, the drip washes the oxalic acid out of the sponge.
Is oxalic acid pad method allowed in any European country that you know, or is there an exemption like in New Zealand?
New Zealand is the only one that I know of. Aluminum cap is, which are the cardboard strips. They're registered several different areas. Back to the feeding one, if you're feeding pollen sub, any pollen sub that is in physical contact with the strip will not, the bees won't eat that sub right there. They'll eat it right next to it, but not on the strip.
Do you see any mites building any sort of resistance to oxalic?
It's going to be really difficult. I'm not going to say it can't happen because nature is just amazing. Evolution is amazing. But if indeed the mode of transmission to the mites is via their sticky pads, their empodia on their feet, which is there's indication that is it. then the mites would not, if they were to toughen their feet, they wouldn't be able to hold on to the bees. In one study that came out of Argentina, after 8 years, 64 applications of oxalic acid, and they tested those mites versus the mites from operation that had never used oxalic acid, there was no sign of resistance whatsoever. So it should still be used in a rotation, probably with Thymol throughout the year. And the first thing most beekeepers say is, Randy, can I just put them in all year long? I say, no, you don't need to put them in all year long. Okay, that put them in when you put your honey supers on, and when you pull your honey off, there's no mites in the hive. Take them out then. Let the bees have a break. You could do a Thymol treatment or something like that. Okay.
Yeah, well, I think you kind of answered this. Given the results you're getting with the 50-gram oxalic release pads, do you still use other mite treatments on those hives?
Yeah, we still, if we need to have a quick mite knockback, we'll use the formic acid. If hive comes in for some reason that, like those ones you saw where the red lines are really high, yeah, we'll use formic acid to blast them. Of course, we don't care about losing the queen on those because we're going to requeen them, because of any high mite hives, we don't want those queens anyway in our operation. So so we blast them with formic, and we are now looking at, we've used Thymol in August for many years very successfully. So we're going to probably we're figuring out how to work our new rotation schedule of our treatments.
Will this work in colder weather?
We have starting a trial this week of that. I'll let you know next year.
Okay, will you be making any of your zero mite queens available for sale?
Wouldn't do you any good so far. And for over the last 5 years, the daughters have not bred true. So you can have a colony that maintains zero mites for 2 years with zero mites, and you breed from her, and maybe 10% of the daughters' colonies are resistant. So that's why I'm saying this year may have been the change, that it looks like we may have gotten into the maternal line. So it's not dependent on the queen mating with the proper drone. So we're hoping that we may make a breakthrough this year. So we don't even claim mite resistance in our queens yet.
One question I think is more for vaporization, but what do you think of the oxalic acid research by Jennifer Berry and Cameron Jack in the South, where they're using 3 or 4 grams of oxalic to treat each hive? Is that too much?
From what they say, no. But it's illegal to do that. Still, and it's going to be up to the new registrant, and they're not telling me who the new registrant is. When I find out, I will approach them to see if they want to pursue changing the approved application methods that way. Again, we've been just abandoned by USDA, who could have done this. I approached IR4, which were very willing to help until they found out that they just changed the registrant. So I'm going to have to see if that will work. The US government is not helping us.
Have there been any investigations into lures that deceive the foundress mites into not entering brood as it is being capped?
No, that's a screaming investigation we need. There's just not enough of me and not enough other people interested in doing these. I would love to be doing that. Anybody wants a good project, I'm happy to talk to them.
Does formic affect the taste of honey?
Does formic affect the taste of honey? Formic will go into the honey temporarily, and then it evaporates out. There's already formic acid in honey. It's a natural component of honey. So, but if you don't extract your honey immediately after application of the strips, it just evaporates right back out.
Okay, this is an earlier question. When you're using the colonies heavy with mites, how do these colonies with mites of counts of 30 plus in early June even make it with mite counts of 30 plus?
We're surprised by that. That we routinely start with mite counts of 50 in our trials. And the extended release, those colonies look beautiful after 2 months. They recover. It takes a while. The only time I've had them fail is this spring. We started with early this spring. We had a few very high mite ones in our preliminary trial, and they didn't make it. But I've been surprised how, if you just put the extended release in there, those colonies don't crash. Their mite count does not drop. You don't even see the mite count drop at all until 3 weeks. So you don't get any noticeable effect. But if it's indeed keeping the foundresses from entering the cells and reproducing, that may be why you don't see them crash. We have lots to learn about what's actually happening with this extended release oxalic acid. I've done a huge amount of research, but there's very few other researchers in the world who have published that kind of research. We just don't know.
Oh, we see. One question about using folded oxalic strips. They look like they make the wax combs like they're burnt where the strip touches. Is it produced by oxalic glycerin percentage?
So you're talking about hanging the strips between the combs?
Yes.
Okay. We don't have much experience with that. I have a trial going with some New Zealand strips right now. There's a number of manufacturers in New Zealand who make cardboard strips, from simple ones to very fancy 3-layer ones that are sewn around the edges. So there's plenty of sale of those. They call them staples over in New Zealand. I got a trial running with some of those right now, so I don't have the experience to see that. But oxalic acid itself does not react with beeswax.
In your breeding program, do you know or have a sense of the mechanism by which the bees control the varroa level? Uncapping, recapping, bald brood, biting mites, uncapping, and removing brood. Other.
I have not investigated that, but I do see a lot of uncapping, recapping behavior, more than I see varroa sensitive hygiene. And based upon my modeling, using my varroa model that I've developed, where I can change the different parameters, so I can add grooming behavior, or I can add any kind of resistance behavior in there. I'm skeptical that grooming or mite binding is ever going to be the answer. The uncapping, recapping is the most promising of what I've seen.
Okay, you mentioned using thymol in the late summer, but what about spring prior to supering your colonies?
You could do that. Thymol could be used like as a swarm prevention measure, because it's disruptive to the colony, and they will reduce brood rearing, often move the brood nest away from the thymol treatment. So that's a possibility. Either do it just before swarm season when you want to reduce swarming. That'd be a possibility. Otherwise, what we want to get it done in August, when any brood that emerges in August never makes it to the winter. They're all going to be too old by the time winter comes around. So you want to have your thymol treatment done by September, so that the brood rearing done in September and October will be your winter cluster then.
Well, what is your opinion on the hive guard that the bees pass through at the entrance and receive a dose of thymol?
I don't have any opinions, but if you want to know data, if you're talking about the one by Reinig Jane, or who are you talking about, I did some testing with her device here, and it looked like it might have some promise, but then I didn't care for her experimental design, and so I passed on the second year of testing that. So I couldn't tell you.
Okay, Jonathan says, thank you, Randy, for talking so long. Take some time to rest your voice, please.
Okay.
And Greg says, we want you around for a long time.
All right. I'll keep working on it. I get a lot of appreciative feedback, and that's what keeps me going.